Hello, Olly here. Just before we start unwrapping the week, I wanted to remind you about The Week magazine. It's the perfect news source for open-minded readers like you, delivered to your door each and every week, including a selection of news, reviews and opinion from more than 200 UK and international sources without partisan bias. And we've got a special offer for you just for listening to this podcast. If you want 6 free issues and a free Moleskine notebook, then go to theweek.co.uk/offer and enter the promo code POD25. That's theweek.co.uk/offer and the promo code POD25. And now, on with the show. It's the week ending Saturday the 18th of July, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Britain banning Huawei from its 5G network, socialite Ghislaine Maxwell denied bail whilst awaiting trial for trafficking, and the hacking of Barack Obama, Jeff Bezos and Kanye West's Twitter accounts in a cryptocurrency scam. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the Week's digital team is Joe Evans, from the Week Junior editor Felicity Capon, and from Money Week it's John, all roads lead to 2008, Stepek. And Joe, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Why a falling birth rate is driving Italy stark raving mad.
There's that idea of the Italian family with lots of kids. I mean, what could be more Italian than that?
I'll tell you that fertility rates have been going down from the mid-60s. To replace the population, every woman should make at least 2 babies during her life. I mean, that's logic. And 1.2 is kind of far from 2.
Professor Angelo Mazza from the University of Catania speaking with Christopher Livesey for PBS NewsHour. Joe, what is the story?
So Italy's birth rate has fallen to its lowest level since records began in 1861. And essentially the country is facing a demographic crisis. The birth rate is now so low that there are concerns that Italy will end up being a sort of geriatric society. There was only 420,000 births recorded last year. It's part of a decade-long decline, but it's a fall of 20,000 on the previous year. And it also comes at a time that the University of Washington has published some research into global birth rates, and it turns out that Italy isn't alone. Populations are due to shrink by the end of the century around the globe, and there's actually 23 countries that are on track to be home to just half as many people.
But there are loads of different reasons why a birth rate might decline. Well, let's go through some of them and tell me which ones you think are the culprits here.
So in Italy, the birth rate has long been masked by immigration, but emigration is now a big problem, with the Italian economy in pretty terrible shape. Lots and lots of young people are fleeing the country, 126,000 last year. And as well as emigration, there's also just sort of social changes to be taken into account. Social structures have changed, religious beliefs in parts of the world have changed in such a way that things like contraception are more widely available. There's also economic prosperity to be taken into account, which perversely you may think that would increase birth rates because people would be able to afford to have more children, but in fact it often means that because more people are in the workplace, there's just less time for family life, which means that families tend to have less and less children.
Yeah, the religion point's interesting, isn't it, Felicity? Because that was kind of the subtext, I think, of the reporter's question that we just heard there. The cliche of Italy being the large families, well, really that's Catholic families, isn't it? Not using contraception is what that's code for.
Yeah, I think so. What's so interesting about the way the person in the clip was talking about it is this sort of idea of women need to be having at least 2 children. And what worries me slightly about this story is that the way people talk about women within the story almost as if they're machines, and we need to just adjust the lever slightly as to how many and how few babies women should be having, rather than looking at, is falling fertility rates actually a success story for women? Is it the emancipation of them? Are you seeing the idea of having babies is that they're expensive? There's a lack of childcare. The idea that women would want their own career and their own life. This could be seen as it's a good thing. So I think there's something in the way they were talking about it that perhaps we are not really looking at the individual female experience in all this, and instead just making it seem like women are just going to churn out babies.
Yeah, I mean, it would have been a less crude way to put it, John, if he'd have said, couples need to have more children. But the need bit that he was talking about, what he was saying was, if we want to correct the balance of old and young in our population, that's the issue, isn't it? They have an ever-aging population, as well as dwindling birth.
Yeah, that's basically the issue. Now, whether or not you think this is a problem, I think people get too angsty about demographics because demographics depends so much on the assumptions that you make. I mean, 5 minutes ago we were all worried about overpopulation. But anyway, so to go back to the point, the issue is the mix. So what happens is the number of young people coming into the workforce dries up. And then at the other end, you've got an ever-increasing kind of group of old people. And obviously old people require more money in terms of their pensions, in terms of funding their healthcare. And overall, you just get less economic dynamism. So it's more about the population mix. In as much as this may or may not be a problem, the economic issue is that you've got too many old people and not enough young people to support them.
And the solution for that, I mean, God, I feel terrible almost articulating this thought, Joe, especially using the word solution. But nonetheless, obviously coronavirus, Italy was hit particularly badly. It does mercilessly target the elderly population. I mean, the truth is actually, if more older people are dying from coronavirus, and there's going to be a second wave, which is anticipated, to an extent, does the population get rebalanced that way anyway?
I mean, there is that logic, I suppose. There is the logic that coronavirus and illnesses that disproportionately hit older people that have grown in prevalence, like heart disease, for example, could be a natural corrective. The issue, though, is actually that young people are still predominantly having too few children. Women in the 1950s are having an average of 4.7 children in their lifetime. And by 2017, that had reached 2.4. The prediction in the Washington University analysis is that will be 1.7 by the end of the century.
I mean, I'm aware this is a very cold way of looking at it, but what are the solutions then? If people, frankly, are not having children, you're only left with migration, aren't you?
There are other things along with migration. There are more imaginative ways of looking at this. Migration is definitely one of them, but artificial intelligence, could we see that becoming a way of looking after old people and being healthier within your old age could be another turning point?
The other issue here is, again, it sort of flags up the problem with thinking about these things that are so long term. Old people are getting healthier as well. This mindset around about the baby boomer era that you had a right to retire at 65 or 60 and then live for maybe 10 years in good health and then die. These days, if somebody stops working at 65, there's a good chance they're still going to be perfectly fit and healthy by the time they're in their mid-80s, and a lot of them are going to live to be over 100. So the way that you solve that problem is to stop people retiring as early. Now, that's politically very difficult. You've seen the objections we've had from raising the pension age to 68, but it's just worth remembering that whenever the welfare state was set up after the Second World War, everybody died before they got their state pension. The state pension was there just in case you lived to be long enough to claim it, but it really was unusual to get it.
I do agree with John that we need to think about it that way round, because efforts to raise the number of young people in the country, frankly, just repeatedly fail. Russia has tried to introduce greater state support for parents and maternity benefits to first-time mothers, and Italy did the same thing. Sweden attempted to do it through a hugely generous family and social benefits package for new parents. But the truth of the matter is it hasn't made any difference. The birth rates in those countries are all still incredibly low. I don't think you're going to be able to reverse the social shifts that have led to young people having less children than they would have had 70 years ago. And so I think actually John is completely correct that we need to start thinking about the other end of this demographic issue, the fact that we're becoming an older society, and maybe reconsider the role of older people in our society in such a way that they become, for lack of a less cold term, more productive than they currently are.
Having said that, though, there is something to watch in the idea that authorities and governments around the world aren't shy about wading in if they do think that their demographics are looking dodgy. And Italy, for example, they brought out posters in 2016 proclaiming beauty knows no age, fertility does. And they had to be taken down amid cries of sexism. But even in China, there's rumblings that couples could be taxed for having too few offspring, and there could be hurdles to getting abortion and divorce. China's a case in point in that there is a big pressure still on women if they have reached a certain age and not had children, that they're kind of the leftover women, and there's big societal and family pressure to have children. So even if it's not quite working and the trends suggest that's the case, I still think it is something to bear in mind with this, that there can be very, very insidious, ominous pressures on women to produce and to have big families if countries get worried about the decline in population.
Yeah, and supporting those women through a care package at maternity and onwards is not a bad thing, I guess, even if it doesn't increase the birth rate. But I'm curious about this point. Overpopulation used to be a bit of a buzzword. People choosing not to have children because they were worried about the state of the planet. And John, you sort of said now we're being told that we're underpopulated. Maybe we're not. I mean, maybe this is a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, I just find it amazing how we can disastrify absolutely everything. Literally last year I was seeing stories about overpopulation and how essentially we're going to swamp the earth and destroy it. It really isn't that long ago that we were talking about extrapolating it out to 13 billion or whatever by, 2100. And again, this is my problem with demographics. It depends on, there are so many issues that affect it. And the idea that this is going to be any more correct than the last view was kind of strikes me as really daft. It's not bad. A lot of this comes from people in poorer countries, and women specifically in poorer countries, getting access to things like contraception and education, and that brings down the fertility rate. It's also about people having better living standards, which also brings down the fertility rate, and it's also about falling child mortality in those countries because obviously if children are more likely to die, then people do have more of them. And it was the same in this country, obviously, in the Victorian era. But also, I do think there's an economic issue in developed countries that we haven't really talked about. I was just reading one of the articles about Italy, and one of the experts was pointing out that this all began when Italians began to view children as a cost rather than a productive unit, if you like. So when you're working in agriculture, a child can be basically a unit of production, to put it in the economic terms, from a very young age. And they can also be looking after the newest ones that come along. Now today, I mean, your kids are probably units of consumption until they're at least in their mid-20s, if not after that. So there's that issue as well. Essentially, children are less affordable than they once were. And that's partly to do with the amount of expectation that we put on them. But I think particularly one thing I noticed when I moved to the southeast is that there was a very, very, very clear, the cost of a child is something that definitely factored into people's thoughts when they were thinking about how many kids they would have, because at the end of the day, if you can't afford a 3-bedroom house, then having 3 kids rather than 2, or 2 kids rather than 1 is much, much harder to contemplate.
And Joe, you chose this story, and we ask you when you're choosing your stories to think about impacts for all of us. So, I mean, yes, Italy's in Europe, but for a listener in the UK, what is the impact of the birth rate declining in Italy?
So the UK birth rate is also incredibly low, just as Italy's is. But I think that the implications for our lives are that this will create societal shift, whichever way you look at it, whether you look at it as in the terms of we've got to increase the number of births. It's a societal change we're going to need to introduce that has so far failed to be implemented basically anywhere. So it may well turn out that these things iron themselves out in the same way that the population bomb did, or it may turn out that in another 10 years we're talking about overpopulation again because the debate has shifted in the other direction.
Okay, well, we're all teed up to discuss a recession, which must mean John is up next after this. Okay, John, your turn. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Have global stock markets lost touch with reality?
Something may be broken in equity markets. Despite the recent sell-off, U.S. stocks are well on their way to erase losses for the year. But the coronavirus pandemic rages on, job losses are steep, and the global economy is facing its worst recession since World War II. So has equity lost touch with reality? Or perhaps the stock market never reflected reality to begin with?
Is there a disconnect between markets and the economy? A video from Bloomberg Markets and Finance. John, what's the story?
Well, earlier this week, the Nasdaq index in the US, which is the one where all the big tech stocks are listed, hit a record high, its highest level ever. Meanwhile, the main US stock market is now higher than it was before COVID-19 kicked off. The other markets around the world haven't come back quite as sharply, but even in the UK, the FTSE 250, which is the most domestically focused market, is down just 11% on where it was this time last year.
So if you didn't know that this background of the coronavirus was happening, if you just saw this market data, you'd think, what, we're in good times?
Yeah, you definitely would, certainly in the US. And even here, you'd be thinking, oh, we're down 10% in last year. Oh, well, I wonder, maybe a bit of froth got blown off the top of the market, or maybe we're worried about trade with China going wrong or something like that. You certainly wouldn't think there's been a global pandemic and there are millions, literally millions of unemployed people all around the world compared to this time last year when we were talking about full employment in most economies.
So, okay, what's going on then? I mean, why is the market so detached from the economy? Because as far as I can tell, looking out the window, there isn't good news happening.
This is one reason I brought this topic up, because it is interesting, because most of us think and feel that there should be some sort of link between stock markets and the economy or economic growth. And the reality is that often the two barely correlate. There's been lots of studies over time done that show that the link between economic growth and stock market performance is actually surprisingly tenuous. So in this case, the US market, the NASDAQ, one reason that that's gone up so much is because that's where all the big tech stocks are listed. So, your kind of Apples and Amazons and all the rest of it. And so those companies have done actually relatively well out of the COVID lockdown because people have assumed that we're going to move much further onto an online world and they're going to get much more benefit in the future. And I think this is the point that you have to remember. The stock market is about looking at the future, and most economic data is about looking at either the present or actually quite often the relatively distant past. Like GDP data is usually about 3 months out of date by the time you see it. So it's partly because the stock market's so forward-looking.
See, I can see, though, Felicity, how people would misinterpret this. They'd look at the stock markets and say, well, things obviously aren't as bad as everyone's saying.
But it's to do with the world's major central banks, how they've tackled coronavirus. So it's the Federal Reserve in the US and pumping loads and loads of money in and sort of creating this illusion that everything's okay. And this has made investors think the worst of it's over and that we're going to be supported and that we can carry on in our own little bubble. And in Australia, you had the Reserve Bank, which embarked on quantitative easing, which is money printing, and then huge fiscal stimulus from governments like the UK with the furlough scheme for workers. That's slightly where the misconception has come from. And obviously the problem is the uncertainty, particularly in this country with the furloughing scheme. Economists don't know what the full effect of unemployment will be until the scheme ends. Things might look okay now, but at some point reality is going to catch up with this bubble.
Is that true, John? Because off the record, when you and I have a chat about what's going on in the business world, you often give the impression that things might be very, very bleak. And so far, you've been proven right this year. So is this a prediction or not?
Felicity's absolutely right, actually. She really put her finger on it. The thing that has short-circuited the market's sort of disaster response is central bank money printing. Effectively, central banks have banned bankruptcy. So what's happened is that there's basically a floor put under the market. The issue here to remember is that whenever all that money's printed, it kind of has to go somewhere. So if you as an investor are looking out a year from now, then yeah, the consequences of coronavirus could still be terrible. But 10 years from now, it's likely to be just seen as another blip on the road to more gains for various companies.
And to return to your favourite topic, is that how 2008 is broadly seen now?
2008 isn't seen so much as a blip, but 2008 was very different to this. So 2008 was a banking crisis. So the banking sector was bankrupt, and if central banks hadn't stepped in at that point, then what would have probably happened is potentially the collapse of the entire financial system. Now, when coronavirus hit, people were worried that something similar might happen simply because of the disruption to the economy. But what happened is central banks acted much faster and they did much more than they did in 2008. And so as soon as they got rid of that possibility of the financial system collapsing, everyone sort of thought, well, okay, eventually things are going to get better. And what I've learned over the last 10 years is that if the market's going to start falling again, central banks will print even more money. Sometimes it's called the central bank put. A put is a form of insurance that you can take out to insure you against falls in the stock market. And this is almost like central banks have put a floor under the stock market by saying, well, anytime anything goes wrong, we're just going to print more money, so you might as well buy. There's a big element of that involved in this.
I guess it can feel kind of elitist as well, can't it, Felicity? Your man and woman in the street just feels, I can't ever really get to grips with the forces going on here.
Yeah, I definitely feel that way. But I think it's also this point of this money, if new money is being created, it's got to go somewhere, as John was saying. And it's the idea of where it goes, right? So if it's put to productive use, if it goes into infrastructure or into the pockets of people on low incomes, people who probably aren't really preoccupied with what's going on in the markets, you could see the money being spent in shops and on services and infrastructure and all that sort of thing. And then perhaps that would put the economy back onto a more sustainable footing. But if it's simply being passed to investors, I don't see that that's going to be so helpful long term, and that makes me more worried. And I'm sure 2008 post-crash, isn't it just the point that, yes, there was a boom, but it also meant that tons and tons of debt was created that we're still sort of weaning ourselves off?
Yeah, that's interesting. I suppose the question that it throws up is, to a complete novice like myself, John, where would the sensible place to be investing money be?
That's put me right on the spot. The first point, on Felicity's point, I would just say that the other innovation that we've had in this crash is actually that some of the printed money is going to normal people. So it's basically printing money that's paying for the furloughs rather than, people being made redundant for,
15% less VAT on my chips yesterday.
Exactly. Rishi's meal deals, all the rest of it. That's basically printed money that's paying for that. So, and this is a big philosophical shift that's being debated and is gradually going on right now. And it's something called modern monetary theory, or MMT. And I suspect you'll read an awful lot about it over the coming 6 months. But it's basically the idea that government can print as much money as it wants, essentially without consequences, until inflation takes off. As for where to invest just now, the reality is that for most normal people, your pension is currently invested in the stock market. So if you have a pension with your work, and unless you work for the public sector, it's going to be a defined contribution pension. And what that means is you save a bit of money every month and it gets invested in funds into the stock market. So most of the time, that's just where your money's going to be going. If you've got any other money and it's available to invest, now I can't give you personal financial advice, so you just have to...
It's fine, Joe doesn't have any money.
You just have to make sure
I'm a millennial, I have no savings.
At your kind of age, Joe, you probably still want the majority of it to be in equities, because you're a young guy, you're not going to be retiring for a very long time.
It's a long-term bet.
Yeah.
Is it a coincidence that modern monetary theory has the same acronym as Magic Money Tree?
That's what it's sort of, sort of completely forgotten.
That's what Theresa May, etc. were mocking. Was it? I didn't know that.
Basically, yeah.
Did you know that as general public, that Magic Money Tree was a jokey reference to that?
I did not know that.
That is...
There we are. I've learnt a thing. I've learned lots of things, John, but that's the thing I'm going to take with me. Sorry.
That's the important one.
Felicity, you are finishing the show. FTS after this. All right, Felicity, you are finishing the show. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Far from the maddening crowds, a quiet crisis is underway.
And for your clip, Felicity, you have chosen some ambient sound. So if you're listening walking down the street right now, do not adjust your headphones. We'll be back in 10 seconds' time. The sound of soundofcolleagues.com. Felicity, what was that?
That was a web page and Spotify playlist called The Sound of Colleagues. It's just filled with workplace sounds that you can put on and adjust. You can have the printer, you can have a coffee machine, the office dog barking. It was set up by Swedish music and sound studio Red Pipe as a joke, but its data and also anecdotal evidence suggests that people are keeping it on as they work from home.
Because they miss the sound of the office in particular?
I put it on yesterday and didn't turn it off. It was actually really nice to have the sounds of the office all around me. I know that sounds very, very sad. But two things caught my eye this week. One was number 10 hinting that its work from home advice is under review and could soon be scrapped. Boris Johnson has said that people should go back to work if it's safe. But then confusingly, the official government line is actually work from home if you can. And this was exemplified rather hilariously by the Justice Secretary, Robert Buckland, causing confusion by saying the guidance is work from home if you can, and then later said the message is yes, come back to work. So I think the government
they can't even tell us if we're supposed to wear a face mask when we go into Pret on the way in.
Yeah, I don't think they quite know what's going on. But then a very good piece in The Guardian about working from home, and it was by Simon Osborne, sort of exploring the world of remote working and painting a less than rosy picture of what it's like for a lot of people. And it does seem that there's a shift in how we're thinking about working from home. We've sort of gone from this idea of, oh, it's so great, we get a little bit longer in bed. And now it feels from this piece that people are saying, actually, this isn't sustainable, it's not productive, it's not effective. And the long-term health and societal implications are considerable for a lot of people.
Okay, so bringing all these threads together, there are a lot of different feelings about working from home. Some to do with helping the economy, some to do with people's mental health, some to do with their workplace productivity. I guess this is kind of falls down to personal views in a way. So what's your take, Felicity, before I broaden this out?
I go through waves. I think I don't want to be told I have to go back in permanently, but equally I don't want to stay in my flat permanently. I think I want the flexibility of being able to come and go.
Yeah, and Joe, it strikes me that the reason that it can feel quite anecdotal, this stuff, despite there being quantifiable data about whether people are more productive, whether they work at home or not, is that everybody's different. And an office is a leveller, isn't it? Whereas everyone's home is also different.
Yeah, I think we're talking about this as if home working is the same for everybody, but of course it isn't. For a start, the layout of everyone's house is different. You know, I live in a very small flat in North London, as we've established from John's investment tips. I'm young, so I have no money.
You've got a loft, though, I can see on your webcam.
Yeah, I'll sit up there and do my work. That sounds lovely. So yeah, people's home lives are all different. It's very difficult to sort of, take broad brush approaches to this topic. I'd actually quite like to speak in defence of the office. I quite miss it and actually really enjoy going into the office. There's two different versions, I think, of disconnect here that needs to be spoken about. One of which is that I think working from home can create a real sense of disconnect from feeling like you're part of your team and that you're kind of able to communicate more effectively and have good ideas about work. And there's sort of a productivity that does come with working alongside your colleagues and also just getting to know them really well and knowing how one another work.
John, looking at you on your webcam, you seem very comfortably ensconced in your Billy bookcase full of economic theory.
It really does depend on your personal circumstances, and at the end of the day, because of where I currently am in life, my personal circumstances definitely suit working from home. I've got a study in my house, which I wouldn't have had 10 years ago. My kids are teenagers. 10 years ago, they'd have been toddlers running around, and that, I'd have been desperate to get back to work. So it is.
I can't imagine what you mean.
Well, aye, exactly. But so yeah, I mean, a lot it does depend on that, and also it does depend. I think actually, Joe, you really there was a good point there, and other people have made this to me when I've been defending the idea of working remotely. Is this thing? My team have worked together mostly for the best part of 5 or 6 years, in some cases over a decade. So we know each other pretty much inside out. We don't, although we're putting a magazine together remotely, a lot of us have worked from home at various points in time, and we basically all know what each other's meant to do, and everyone knows things can run smoothly. But if we were trying to launch a new magazine, or if a load of us were to suddenly leave and start up somewhere else, then I struggle to think it would not be as easy to do things every week as it is now. So yeah, it definitely does depend on your circumstances. But I'm certainly happier being out of the office.
I mean, actually, your colleagues at the Week Junior USA, Felicity, have been doing exactly that, haven't they? Launching the magazine remotely at the moment. Have you observed this fact, that it's easier for you, being line manager, to colleagues that you know really well, rather than people you're working with for the first time?
I can't imagine how they've done it. I think putting a magazine out under lockdown is just such an achievement. I'm in complete awe of what they've done. It was a weird one in that, to begin with, we genuinely didn't know whether we could do it. We hadn't had the whole team working individually, and there was definitely a sense of camaraderie of like, oh, brave new world, exciting times, we can do this. And I think as lockdown has worn on, there's certainly been more problems and anxieties on display. There is this also idea of, will it be down to individual employees? Will they have a bit more power to decide where they want to work? And, will companies have to entice their workers back in by sort of making workplaces that are a bit more fancy and nice?
Or are we overthinking this, Joe? And because that's our brief. And actually, it comes down to something much more straightforward and simple than all of this, which is it doesn't matter how safe your workplace is. People don't want to take public transport at the moment because there's a pandemic. And once that's gone away, this will naturally, the figures will fall into the right place. People who need to work from an office will. People who want to work from home will.
The tube doesn't feel like the most hygienic place at the best of times. So in the middle of a global health pandemic, definitely doesn't feel like somewhere that I'd want to spend any length of time. I do think there is something slightly wider about this, and something that we should take into account is the fact that home working for lots of people is also co-home working. Most people share a house with a partner or other loved ones. And I think, I can't remember who it was that said that the meaning of life is love and work, but those two things are two discrete things that shouldn't necessarily always mix together. I'm wording this very carefully, I don't know if you can tell. But I think sometimes working alongside your loved ones every day can be a bit of a strain and a bit disastrous. And that for people who enjoy their jobs and like their jobs, heading into the office, being part of a team that is your own and having something that's distinctly yours and not part of your non-work life is quite important to them.
John?
Yeah, I definitely take the point. I just like the opportunity to get out of the office. There's another thing that bugs me more at a slightly abstract level, but whenever I hear people defending the office, it's often people talking about this idea of the kind of serendipity of co-workers bumping into each other and having amazing sort of business-changing ideas. And it's this idea, the nudging office that was sort of fetishised by WeWork, and the kind of office where you're all sort of being funneled into a carefully designed building that will maximise your productivity. There's a tiny bit of me that just really rebels against that idea. Now, I know that that's different to what we're talking about, but I think that...
No, it's not. It is related to it. Have you never had that experience? You've never had that thing of let's go downstairs and have a coffee and bitch about the boss and then, suddenly we've got a good idea.
I mean, I've had it, but not to the extent that I would, because the whole point is usually the bosses that are trying to program their offices and design them strategically so that, what was that thing? WeWork used to have tiny corridors, apparently, or they tried to design them small so that people would bump into one another as they were getting cups of tea or whatever, and then they would chat and somehow their minds would, mingle and create genius ideas. And that sort of thing's like a fantasy of the CEOs.
I think basically, Felicity, it's that John thinks that bosses are intrinsically evil by trying to get people to mingle.
Felicity and I also share a floor with John, so clearly it's just not very interesting and he doesn't want to in the corridor.
I think he's just feeling left out that he hasn't been invited to Joe and our very exciting coffee chat.
It's true.
It's definitely the case, though, that working from home, you aren't having those spontaneous chats. And I think you do lose something. And people talk about feeling more distant from the company, that they're not really part of it and feeling slightly more alienated. And then on a more serious note, what about your rights as an employee? And is it harder to know how colleagues are being treated? And if you're fearful that you could lose your job, is stuff going on there which is actually really serious? And again, with mental health, just because you're working from home, it doesn't mean your company doesn't have a responsibility to check in on your welfare.
Felicity, what do you miss about the dentist's office?
This is rose-tinted spectacles, but I miss everything from getting on the tube and just being in central London, going to the pub for drinks after work. I miss the sounds, the little interactions. I will get back there and probably be moaning away, but I do think there's something to be said for being in an office environment.
Okay. Well, I will listen out for the sound of you moaning next time I tune into soundofcolleagues.com. But on that, it is time to wrap up this edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to the happy working team of Felicity, John and Joe. Remember, you can listen to our entire back catalogue. Just search for The Week Unwrapped on your podcast app of choice. It is the perfect background noise, whether working from home or in the office. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sarah Miles at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.